The Vatican never feared that the Maya prophecies were false. They feared the possibility that they were true. On the winter solstice of 2012, the long count calendar of the Maya reached its 13th back tune. For centuries, whispers had clung to that date, not as a prediction of fire and ruin, but as the close of one immense cycle, a moment when the serpent of time might turn upon itself. At the same moment, the sun, the earth, and the very heart of the Milky Way lay in near alignment, a rare configuration that some quietly called dangerous knowledge. Hidden reports, sealed manuscripts, and fragments of codices suggested that the serpent, the feathered Kukulkan, was destined to return when the heavens coiled into such a shape, not to end the world but to renew it. And so the question lingers in silence, unanswered. Was December 21st, 2012 the end, or was it a turning? Welcome to Serene Myths. If you wish, you may like or subscribe to let these stories find you again when the night is long. And if you feel inclined, leave a comment below. Tell us where in the world and at what time of night you find yourself listening to this spiral of history. Now let the noise of the day fade. Close your eyes if you wish, slow your breath, and follow the coil backward toward the first shadows of a jungle empire and the voices that began this turning. The desert air cools sharply once the sun has slipped beneath the horizon. Stone temples worn by centuries of wind hold the memory of heat a little longer, breathing it out slowly into the night. On the longest night of the year, December 21st, 2012, thousands of people gathered near the pyramids of Central America, their eyes turned upward, their voices hushed, waiting for a moment they believed was written long before their own births. The Maya long count calendar had reached its great turning, a date that newspapers, films, and endless rumors had proclaimed as the end of time itself. Yet within the quiet atmosphere of that night, something more subtle seemed to be happening, something less like an ending and more like the pause between two breaths. Astronomers noted that the date coincided with a rare alignment. The sun, the earth, and the dark rift at the center of the Milky Way appeared almost in a straight line, a configuration not repeated often on the scale of human history. For scholars in Rome, especially those close to the Vatican's secret archives, the coincidence was troubling. Not because they believed the world would vanish in fire or flood, but because ancient records suggested the Maya had anticipated these celestial events with uncanny precision. If a people, dismissed for centuries as pagan or primitive, could read the sky with such clarity, what else might they have known? What cycles might they have tracked, beyond the reach of modern science, beyond the grasp of theology? It was not the fear of apocalypse that stirred unease in those marble halls. It was the possibility that the Maya had been too precise. Across Central America that night, the atmosphere was charged. Some waited in silence on the steps of ruined pyramids, letting the chill stones seep into their skin. Others lit candles or small fires, circling them with songs that had passed through generations. In Yucatan, a group of elders performed a vigil, not speaking, only breathing together as the stars wheeled overhead. Witnesses remembered a sound, faint and strange, like the rustling of scales across stone when the wind coiled through the temple stairways. They said it was the serpent returning, a breath of Kukulkan whispering through the cracks of time. Modern scientists debated what the alignment really meant. The sun does not truly cross the galactic center in any physical sense. It is more a matter of perspective from Earth. The dark rift is a band of interstellar dust blocking the Milky Way's glow. Yet the coincidence of date, solstice, and position stirred the imagination. The question was not whether the universe had shifted in that moment, but whether human consciousness was shaped by the rhythm of cycles that civilizations like the Maya encoded in stone and ritual. If time was a wheel rather than a line, then December 21st, 2012 was not a wall but a hinge, not the last stroke of a clock, but the swing of its pendulum. The Vatican's unease found form in scattered documents, some genuine, some whispered. In one letter attributed to a Jesuit astronomer of the 20th century, the phrase recurs, scientia periculosa, dangerous knowledge. Dangerous, not because it could destroy faith outright, but because it might reshape how humanity understood the heavens. The Maya seemed to treat the sky not as a distant vault of stars, but as a breathing partner, a body with which rituals of fire and silence kept rhythm. If their calendar could anticipate the position of the sun against the galaxy's heart, then perhaps their myths of serpents and cycles contained more than allegory. They might have been maps written in mythic language, pointing toward recurring patterns in the cosmos. For those standing on temple steps that December night, none of this was abstract. The air cooled, the stars sharpened, and the line of the Milky Way rose like a river of dust. The solstice sun touched the horizon, and with it the sense that one great count of time had ended. Yet no one vanished. The world did not collapse. Instead, dawn broke as it always had, though some claimed it felt fractionally delayed, as if the morning took one extra breath before revealing its light. In that small hesitation, imagination found endless room to wander. Was it the end or the beginning again? Did the serpent devour its tail and, in doing so, make the circle whole? The long count calendar does not end in oblivion. It rolls forward into another back tune, the way a clock, once striking 12, begins again at 1. Scholars explain this patiently, yet the allure of finality, apocalypse destruction, was too tempting for modern culture to resist. Newspapers and films thrived on catastrophe. But within the ruins, under the stone stairways and carved lintels, the message was gentler. Time turns. The wheel continues. What feels like death may only be the curve of renewal. As the night deepened, some participants closed their eyes, sitting against the cold stone, listening for subtle signs, the whisper of wind, the rhythm of heartbeats in unison, the soft crackle of fire. The sense of scale was overwhelming. To imagine one's own life as a fleeting grain within cycles that spanned thousands of years was both humbling and oddly soothing. If time itself curved endlessly, then endings were illusions, and fear could be set aside like a cloak at night. In Rome, the question remained unsettled. Was it coincidence that the Maya calendar closed at a moment of such celestial alignment? Or was it evidence of a lost science, a way of seeing the heavens that modern instruments, for all their precision, had somehow forgotten? The debate was less about astronomy than about authority. Who held the right to interpret the sky, the church, with its theology of creation, or a vanished civilization whose stones still tracked the stars with uncanny accuracy? The serpent coiled not only across the stairways of pyramids, but within the corridors of power, silent yet pressing. Imagine, for a moment, standing on that pyramid yourself. The steps beneath you are cool, their edges softened by centuries. The horizon is wide, the jungle stretching in dark waves. Above, the Milky Way arcs a river of light, and for a brief instant, the sun, the earth, and that river's center seem to line up, like beads on a string drawn taut. You breathe, slowly. You feel your body as one small piece within a turning greater than comprehension. It does not frighten you. It steadies you as though the pulse of the universe has slowed to match your own. The night passes. Fires burn low. Those who gathered disperse, some relieved that the world has not ended, others quietly convinced that something invisible has shifted. In the morning, the temples glow with first light, the serpent stone head at Chichen Itza catching the edge of the sun. The cycle continues, the calendar turns. And in archives across the ocean, the faint rustle of old papers reminds the keepers of secrets that the question has not closed. From that hinge of 2012, the story bends backward, drawing us into older times, into letters carried from the Yucatan in the 16th century, into the smoke of burned codices and the uneasy silence of missionaries who saw more in the temples than they dared to admit. The serpent waits in those pages too, winding through centuries, its scales glinting faintly where ink and stone still remember. The light of one solstice becomes the ember that leads us further into the past. Long before the anxious gatherings of 2012, long before the Vatican's private whispers of dangerous knowledge, the Maya had already inscribed their vision of time into stone. Their calendar was not a single sheet with days marked off, nor a wheel that turned just once. It was a system of cycles nested within cycles, each rotation interlocking with another, the way gears in a great clock mesh to keep rhythm. At its heart lay the long count, a measure vast enough to cradle entire civilizations, stretching across thousands of years. The long count divided time into units called baktun. One baktun was about 400 years long, and 13 of them formed a great cycle of over 5,000 years. The count that began in what we would call 3114 BCE had rolled forward until it approached its 13th completion on December 21st, 2012. For modern ears, the number sounded final, like a calendar running out of pages. But for the Maya, whose sense of time was circular rather than linear, the ending was only the beginning again, just as the serpent's mouth closes upon its tail. Stone monuments recorded these counts with a language of dots and bars. Each dot marked a single unit, each bar marked 5. To read them was to hear the echo of drums, the heartbeat of rituals that kept pace with the cosmos. Imagine standing in front of a stela, carved over 1,000 years ago. Its surface is worn, but the patterns remain clear. A single line of bars and dots carries the weight of centuries, telling not of an end, but of a turning. Scholars have compared this notation to music, a score played across time where every mark was a beat and every baktun a measure. It was not just numbers. The Maya wove myth and cosmology into their calendar. Each cycle mirrored the great stories of creation and destruction, of gods forming the world from maize, of floods and fires that had reshaped the earth before. To live within such a system was to see history as a spiral, always returning, yet never the same. The end of one cycle was not a wall but a doorway, a pause before stepping again into the rhythm of creation. Quirky details emerged from the way the calendar was physically used. Some stones were placed so that on certain days, the rising sun would illuminate them in exact patterns. Holes cut into temple walls allowed shafts of light to fall directly on glyphs at solstice or equinox. A priest might stand in the darkness, waiting for the moment. A beam struck the carved sign of a god, signaling the renewal of the count. The entire temple became an instrument, tuned to the heavens, sounding silently as light and shadow marked the beat. Modern debate circles around whether the Maya truly predicted the alignment of 2012. Astronomers argue that while they tracked cycles of the Sun, the Moon and Venus with great accuracy, there is little evidence they calculated the galactic center as we define it today. What they did see, however, was the dark band of the Milky Way overhead, a river of stars whose cleft resembled the body of a cosmic serpent. Their mythology called it the Xibalba Bay, the road to the underworld. To them, the crossing of the Sun with this dark rift held meaning, whether or not it matched the calculations of modern astrophysics. The serpent in the sky and the serpent carved in stone were reflections of the same truth, cycles converging, renewing, spiraling onward. If one listens carefully, the debate itself becomes part of the rhythm. On one side, the scientific insistence on evidence, on calculations measurable and repeatable. On the other, the poetic sense that meaning lies not only in precision, but in resonance, in the way myth and observation weave together. Perhaps the Maya did not predict the galactic alignment in our terms. Perhaps instead they lived in such close conversation with the sky that they felt its movements intuitively, embodying them in ritual, story, and stone. Imagine yourself walking through the ruins of Copan or Tikal at dawn. The stone is cool beneath your feet, the jungle mist heavy with the smell of wet leaves. A shaft of sunlight pierces the horizon, slipping through a narrow slit in the temple wall, striking the glyph of a Bakhtun. The air is utterly still. You breathe in, and for a moment you sense the immense machinery of time turning, not above you, not outside you, but through you. It is less like a countdown than like the swing of a pendulum, the inhalation before the next exhale. This is why the long count feels so different from modern calendars. We imagine time as a line, one event following another, progress or decline, a story that begins and ends. The Maya imagined time as breath. Every cycle was an inhale, every ending an exhale. The cosmos did not march forward, it pulsed. And in 2012, what pulsed was not death, but renewal. Some Catholic scholars argued this view was dangerous because it challenged the linear model of creation and salvation. If time is a circle, what becomes of a single, decisive moment of redemption? If cycles repeat, then beginnings and endings lose their sharpness, their absolutes. For a faith built on a unique point in history, the spiral was unsettling. And yet within that spiral lies a profound comfort. Nothing is ever truly lost. Everything returns, transformed but familiar. On that December night in 2012, while many feared apocalypse, others welcomed the turning with quiet joy. They knew the long count did not end. It rolled over like a great stone wheel, clicking into its next measure. One Bakhtun ended, another began. To them, it was not the closing of a book, but the turning of a page, part of a story that would never run out of words. The symbols remain carved into stone, waiting for anyone who pauses to look. They are not prophecies of doom, but reminders of rhythm. The dots and bars beat like a drum. The serpent coils, the sunbeam strikes, the calendar breathes. And as you stand before it in the silence of ruins where vines creep and birds call faintly in the canopy, you feel the strange calm of knowing that time itself is not a cliff but a circle, not an ending but a return. The stones hold their silence, the jungle breathes, and from the shadows of the temple's stair, a beam of light begins to stretch, pointing forward into the story of alignments, of stars and temples built to catch them, a story that waits in the next moment to unfold. High above the jungles of Central America, The night sky unfolds like a vast tapestry, its threads woven in starlight. Among those threads lies a shadow, a dark lane that cuts across the Milky Way. Modern astronomers call it the Great Rift, a swathe of interstellar dust that hides the galaxy's center from naked eyes. To the ancient Maya, it was more than an absence of light. It was a living pathway, the road to Xibalba, the underworld, a celestial river through which serpents slithered and souls passed. On December 21st, 2012, as the solstice sun set and the Milky Way arched overhead, the sun's path aligned with this shadowy lane. For some, it was nothing more than an astronomical curiosity. For others, it was proof that the Maya had foreseen a convergence so rare that it still sparks debate. Factually, the alignment was a matter of perspective. The sun, from Earth's vantage point, appeared near the center of the Milky Way at solstice. In truth, the scales of space were too vast for a perfect overlap. The galactic center lies some 26,000 light-years away, its black hole concealed by dust. But to the human eye, the impression was clear. The sun had touched the dark rift, just as Maya glyphs and myths had described in layered symbolism. Scholars pointed out that the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis, caused this apparent alignment, one that lingers across several decades rather than a single pinpoint date. Still, the coincidence of its peak near 2012 proved irresistible to imagination. The Maya carved serpents curling down stairways, their heads waiting to catch the light. At Chichen Itza, the pyramid of Kukulkan reveals its secret each equinox, when the setting sun casts triangular shadows along its balustrade, creating the illusion of a serpent descending. At Copan, inscriptions trace the cycle of Venus, charting its appearance as morning and evening star with precision rivaling modern tables. These were not decorative accidents, they were instruments. Temples became devices that measured the sky through shadow and stone, translating the heavens into earthly forms. To stand within them was to stand inside a cosmic clock. One quirky detail emerges from an account left by early missionaries. A friar described a slit in a temple wall that admitted a beam of light only on the winter solstice. The beam struck the carved head of a serpent, illuminating its eye. The priest who guided him explained that this was the moment when the serpent awoke to begin another cycle. The friar, unsettled, noted the precision but dismissed it as superstition. Yet centuries later, archaeologists found similar shafts of light at multiple sites, aligned with solstices and equinoxes, supporting the story's accuracy. These structures were more than monuments, they were calendars of stone. The debate arises when considering how deeply the Maya understood the galactic structure. Could they truly have anticipated the alignment of the sun with the Milky Way's center? Some scholars argue they lacked the tools to calculate such a concept. Others point out that their myths of the cosmic tree, whose roots and branches stretch across the heavens, correspond strikingly to the Milky Way's form. The road to Xibalba runs through the dark rift, and in their stories, the sun must cross this road to complete its journey. Whether by observation or intuition, their narratives mirrored cosmic realities with uncanny resonance. Imagine yourself at Tikal during the solstice. The jungle hums softly, the air cool and damp. You climb the steep steps of a temple, breath slowing, until you reach the summit. From here, the horizon stretches wide. The Milky Way arches overhead, luminous and vast. As the sun sets, its light brushes the edge of the dark rift, and for a moment it seems to slip into shadow. You feel a chill, not of fear, but of recognition. that this crossing has been seen before, that it is part of a cycle older than memory, inscribed in myth and stone. The Vatican's unease with such ideas stemmed not only from theology, but from symbolism. To admit that the Maya foresaw this convergence was to grant them a kind of cosmic authority. It suggested that their myths were not idle stories, but frameworks of knowledge, parallel to scripture, perhaps even rivaling it. Within certain documents, now yellowed and fragile, phrases appear, signa periculosa, dangerous signs. The fear was not of destruction, but of recognition that another culture's wisdom might rival the Church's own narrative of time. Quirky echoes of this fear appear in letters from the 17th century, where missionaries describe being unsettled by the way temples interacted with the sky. One noted that the echo of a clap at Chichen Itza returned as a chirp, like the call of a sacred bird, coinciding with equinox rituals. The interplay of sound, light, and myth created a world where the divine was not abstract but tangible, woven into architecture itself. To live within such spaces was to inhabit a cosmos where time was measured not by numbers on a page, but by the dance of shadow, the song of echoes, the gaze of stars. The debate continues today among historians and astronomers. Was the 2012 alignment a profound moment of cosmic significance, or merely the midpoint of a long precessional cycle stretched across centuries? Was the serpent's descent at Chichen Itza a deliberate astronomical instrument, or a symbolic coincidence? The answers depend on perspective, yet the beauty lies in the ambiguity. The Maya did not separate science from story, myth from measurement. For them, the two were inseparable, threads in the same tapestry. To ask whether they predicted the galactic alignment is perhaps the wrong question. They lived it, enacted it, inscribed it in stone and ritual without needing the language of astrophysics. As the solstice night deepens, the stars thicken. The Milky Way glows like powdered silver, and the dark rift yawns, vast and silent. You close your eyes, breathing with the rhythm of the jungle, and feel the wheel of time turning not in sudden catastrophe, but in steady rotation. The serpent stirs, coils and descends, not to devour, but to renew. The calendar breathes, the temple sings with shadow, and the cosmos continues its slow, endless dance. And from that cosmic stage, attention begins to turn toward the human record, the letters, the codices, the documents carried across oceans. For in the years after first contact, Europeans began to write their own accounts of these temples, these calendars, these serpents of light and shadow. Those papers, fragile and secret, would shape centuries of debate, and in them, the story of fear and fascination would find its next chapter. The echo of stone calendars and serpent shadows did not remain only in the jungles of Central America. They traveled, carried across the ocean by ink and parchment, whispered through corridors where marble columns rose and frescoes shone in candlelight. In Rome, amid the hushed archives of the Vatican, the murmurs of Maya precision unsettled those who considered themselves guardians of divine chronology. For centuries, the Church had taught that time was a straight road. It began with creation, it moved forward through the ages, and it would culminate in a single moment of judgment. To hear of a people who measured time as a cycle, who aligned their temples to the sky with exactness, who spoke of renewal instead of finality, this was a challenge that felt less like heresy and more like dangerous competition. By the 20th century, as archaeologists uncovered more codices and fragments, some Jesuit scholars began to piece together correlations between Maya cycles and celestial events. In private notes, phrases appear, "science too exact," "dangerous knowledge," "to be handled with caution." They were not afraid of catastrophe, they were afraid of losing monopoly over the story of time. If the Maya had anticipated the solstice alignment, then perhaps their myths contained truths that had been overlooked, truths that could stand alongside Scripture. The serpent winding through their temples might not be pagan fantasy, but a metaphor as profound as any biblical symbol. A quirky anecdote surfaces from these archives. A letter dated to the 1930s describes a Jesuit astronomer visiting ruins in Yucatan. He wrote of standing within a temple chamber as the solstice sun pierced a small opening, a beam of light falling exactly on a carved glyph. "The effect was so perfect," he wrote, "that I felt myself inside a machine of stone, designed not by men but by time itself." The letter was filed under restricted circulation, its author later transferred. Whether the transfer was coincidence or consequence remains unclear, but the letter itself remains a testament to awe. Even a man trained in science and faith could not escape the sense that the Maya had engineered an intimacy with the heavens unlike anything in Europe. The debate in Rome sharpened when the year 2012 began to approach. In public, church spokesmen dismissed the idea of an apocalypse as superstition. In private, some records suggest otherwise, not fear of the end, but concern about the questions the date would awaken. Why did the Maya choose this hinge of time? Was it random, or was it anchored in observations too precise to ignore? Did the serpent they carved on stone stairs mirror the serpent of stars curling through the Milky Way? And if so, how much did they truly know? The unease was not about destruction, but about credibility. If the Maya could be shown to have anticipated cosmic alignments with accuracy, then the neat linearity of biblical chronology would feel less inevitable. Imagine walking through the Vatican's libraries at night, the air dry with the scent of parchment, the silence broken only by the faint creak of wooden shelves. Behind locked doors lie manuscripts labelled "restricted." Some of them are no more than travelers' accounts, exaggerated and half-believed. Others contain tables of eclipses, lists of planetary risings, diagrams of temples, as if they were instruments. To the reader who knows how to look, they whisper of a parallel astronomy, one that does not divide science and myth. And as your footsteps echo across the marble floor, you sense the tension, faith insisting on a line, the Maya suggesting a circle. Quirky traces of this tension appear in art as well. Some scholars claim that motifs in Renaissance frescoes, particularly in the Sistine Chapel, echo patterns found in Maya codices. A constellation arrangement here, a spiral there, faint enough to pass as coincidence, suggestive enough to stir speculation. Did Michelangelo or his patrons ever encounter such knowledge? Or are these resemblances nothing more than the human tendency to find patterns everywhere? The question is never resolved, but the whispers persist, passed among those who look too closely at ceilings and too deeply into stars. Debate among modern historians often circles back to the problem of sources. Many of the most tantalizing claims come from documents of uncertain provenance. Letters without signatures, reports without originals, references in catalogues to books now missing. Skeptics argue that such fragments prove nothing beyond human imagination. Believers counter that the very act of suppression, of restriction, suggests the presence of something worth hiding. Between these positions lies a murky space where fact and rumor entwine like the coils of a serpent, indistinguishable in the shadows. Yet within that murk, the emotional truth remains. The idea that another culture could look at the sky and read it with such precision strikes chords of both admiration and fear. Admiration for the brilliance of observation, the beauty of myth woven with measurement. Fear for what it means about the limits of one's own tradition, the possibility that the story told for centuries is not the only story. To admit cycles is to admit repetition, to allow that endings may be illusions, and for a worldview that thrives on singular beginnings and final judgments, the circle is unsettling. Imagine yourself now not in the jungle, but in Rome. The sound of bells carries faintly through the night air, mingling with the rustle of leaves in courtyards. Within the walls of the Vatican, candles burn low. A scholar leans over a desk copying passages from a codex whose pages smell faintly of smoke, relic of fires long ago. His pen hesitates as he writes the date 2012 in the margin, as if the number itself holds a weight his faith cannot resolve. He closes the book, slides it back into a drawer, and locks it. Outside, the night continues, stars wheeling overhead, as they always have, indifferent to fear or doctrine. The story, however, does not remain confined to Rome. The whispers of precision, the stories of temples as instruments, spread back into the Americas, into the hands of travelers, missionaries, and chroniclers. Some carried awe, others suspicion. From these scattered reports, the narrative of burning codices, of hidden knowledge, of serpents traced in shadow, begins to take form. And within that narrative lies a moment of fire that would define centuries of silence. The great burning of 1562, when ink and skin of deer were turned to ash in the square at Mani. It is to that fire and to what it left behind that the path of the story now bends. The year was 1533, and the first letters from Yucatan began to cross the sea. They carried with them not only descriptions of landscapes and people, but whispers of temples whose very stones seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the sky. These reports reached Europe at a time when the old world was still adjusting to the shock of the new. Conquistadors returned with tales of gold and battles, missionaries with stories of souls to be saved, but among their papers lay fragments far more curious, notes on structures that caught the sun like instruments, and rituals that matched the turning of the heavens with uncanny precision. One such letter described the city of Uxmal, where pyramids rose in terraces, their stairways climbing steeply toward the sky. The writer, a cleric traveling with soldiers, noted that during certain days of the year, the rising sun seemed to sit exactly atop the temple, illuminating its crest with a crown of fire. He wrote of crowds gathered in silence at dawn, their faces painted, their bodies still, waiting not for words, but for light. To him, it was a strange and unsettling worship. To the Maya, it was continuity, the living proof that time's great wheel remained aligned. In another report from the same year, a different observer described a ritual at dawn. He claimed that as the first rays of sunlight struck the stone steps of the pyramid, a hush fell over the crowd. No drums, no chants, no cries of battle, only silence, deep and collective, as if the entire community inhaled together, waiting for the cosmos to exhale. For him, the silence was more frightening than any noise. "They wait for the sky itself," he scribbled in Latin. "Not for a priest, not for an idol, but for the sky." He did not know he had witnessed a solstice alignment, where shadow and light marked the transition of seasons, embedding human life within cosmic rhythm. These accounts, fragile in ink and parchment, found their way eventually to libraries and perhaps even into Rome's quieter corners. They contained no predictions of apocalypse, no fiery catastrophes. Instead, they revealed a people attuned to cycles, whose rituals breathed with the same cadence as solstice and equinox. For those who read them, the realization was troubling. The Maya had charted time not only with calendars but with their very cities, building architecture that became instruments of light. A quirky detail appears in one of these letters, written by a friar who had lingered too long in the ruins at dawn. He confessed that as the sun rose, he heard a sound like the hissing of a serpent across stone. At first, he thought it a trick of his ears, but later he learned that the stairway had been built in such a way that the wind itself could create that noise at certain hours. To him, it was a sinister illusion. To the Maya, it may have been the voice of Kukulkan confirming the serpent's eternal presence at the boundary between shadow and day. Debate continues over the authenticity of some of these earliest letters. Scholars argue about the accuracy of translation, about whether descriptions were exaggerated to impress European readers or to frighten them with tales of pagan rites. Yet enough consistency threads through the documents to suggest that the witnesses had indeed seen something remarkable: temples aligned with the heavens, rituals matched to the solar year, and a people who waited in silence not for destruction, but for renewal. Even if the writers misunderstood, the images remain vivid: the hush before dawn, the sudden blaze of light, the whisper of wind across stone. Imagine standing there yourself in 1533 among soldiers and friars who clutch their cloaks against the morning chill. The jungle smells damp, heavy with dew. The stone steps rise before you, steep and ancient. The crowd of Maya villagers stands motionless, their breath visible in the cool air, their faces turned east. You feel the tension of waiting. And then the sun rises, a blade of light cutting the horizon. It strikes the crest of the pyramid, and for an instant the stone glows as if alive. No one moves, no one speaks. The silence deepens until you too feel compelled to hold your breath. The moment stretches, timeless. Then the light shifts, spilling down the stairway, and the serpent seems to descend. Only then do the villagers exhale, softly, like wind through leaves. Such scenes, once captured in letters, became both fascination and warning in Europe. Some saw them as evidence of natural wisdom, others as proof of dangerous superstition. In Rome, where theology guarded the straight path of history, the idea that time could be circular was unsettling. Yet even skeptics could not deny the accuracy of the alignments. The temples had been built with intention, with knowledge that reached beyond mere chance. And if these people could build with such precision, what else might they have known? What cycles might they have anticipated, hidden in the turning of their great calendar? Quirky fragments of language reveal the mindset of the Europeans who recorded these events. One called the temples machines of stone. Another wrote of silent organs that play with light. They could not reconcile what they saw with the categories they carried. Were these places churches, observatories, or something else entirely? The Maya had not separated science from faith, measurement from myth. To them, a beam of light was both data and prayer, both astronomy and devotion. To the Europeans, this union was bewildering, threatening, and strangely compelling. Debated to this day is how much of these early letters reached the Vatican itself. Some argue that they were catalogued quietly in colonial archives, of interest only to administrators and missionaries. Others insist that copies or summaries were carried to Rome, where they were locked away among documents deemed too ambiguous, too unsettling to circulate freely. Whatever the truth, the Whispers of 1533 became the first step in a long chain of reports, each adding weight to the image of the Maya not as primitive idolaters, but as keepers of a cyclical science, a rhythm of time measured not by conquest, but by the stars. As the year 1533 faded into memory, those letters continued their journey, folded in chests, copied into journals, passed from hand to hand. They carried the scent of the jungle and the hush of dawn, even as they traveled through the damp stone corridors of European cities. They seeded a sense of unease that would grow over decades, until one man in Yucatan decided that such knowledge was too dangerous to be left in the hands of the people. His act of fire in 1562 would erase countless codices, leaving only ashes and silence. But from those ashes, fragments would endure, smuggled, hidden, carried, to ignite questions centuries later. The jungle holds its breath at dawn, and stone rises from it like islands in a green sea. At Tikal, at Copan, at Uxmal, the pyramids and temples still stand, not only as remnants of vanished kingdoms, but as instruments that once played with light. To walk among them is to step inside a machine built of shadow and sunrise, calibrated with such precision that it could capture the turning of the heavens. These structures were not mute, they were tuned. Their stones sang silently with solstice and equinox, with the bright wanderings of Venus, with the rhythm of time itself. Tikal, with its soaring temples that pierce above the canopy, demonstrates this in dramatic form. From certain vantage points, the sunrise at the solstice aligns exactly with the peaks of neighboring temples, forming a sightline across the city that marks the cycle of the year. Imagine standing on the top of Temple Farsi as the sun crests the horizon. Its rays spill directly along the line of structures, a golden thread stretched across stone. To the Maya, this was not spectacle, it was confirmation. The cosmos had struck its chord again. The great wheel of time had completed another beat, and human life was held within that harmony. At Copan, further south, the fascination turned skyward to Venus. The Maya watched the planet with extraordinary devotion, charting its appearances and disappearances across the horizon. They knew when it would rise as the morning star, when it would vanish, when it would re-emerge as the evening star. Their calculations proved so exact that centuries later, modern astronomers have marveled at the accuracy. Temples were positioned to frame Venus's movements, stairways carved with glyphs recounting its cycles. For the Maya, Venus was more than a light in the sky. It was a companion in battle, a harbinger of change, a star whose rhythm wove into their rituals of war and peace. When Venus rose at dawn, it was a signal, not of astrology as we know it, but of alignment between human action and celestial order. Uxmal offers yet another example, its pyramid of the magician, with curved sides rising out of the earth like a shell. Legends claim it was built in a single night by a magical dwarf, but the reality is equally mysterious. The temple aligns with the setting sun on particular days, and its doorways frame stars at key points in the year. Even the acoustics of its courtyard seem designed to transform sound into resonance. Clap your hands at the base of a stairway, and the echo returns not as a clap, but as a chirp, resembling the call of the sacred Quetzal bird. Light and sound, shadow and echo, each was a tool for measuring the cosmos, woven seamlessly into architecture. Quirky details abound in the way these structures interact with the natural world. At Chichen Itza, the descent of the serpent on the equinox stairway is famous, but lesser known is the way wind moves through certain stone corridors. When the breeze threads the narrow passages, it produces a hiss, eerily similar to the sound of scales shifting. To stand there is to hear the serpent breathing, its presence not carved but conjured by air itself. Such sensory tricks were not accidents, they were deliberate, creating a theatre where human senses confirmed cosmic truths. You did not simply observe the cycle, you felt it in your bones, heard it in your ears, breathed it into your lungs. Debate continues over how precise this knowledge truly was. Some argue that alignments were exaggerated by modern interpreters, eager to see patterns where coincidence might suffice. After all, a temple aligned with the sunrise will inevitably mark some date, some solstice or equinox, if only by chance. Others counter that the sheer number of these alignments across multiple sites cannot be accidental. The Maya did not build blindly, they surveyed the heavens, tested their structures, refined their designs until stone matched sky. Whether or not every claimed alignment holds enough do to prove intentionality beyond doubt. The question that unsettled later scholars, especially in Europe, was how the Maya achieved such precision without telescopes or metal instruments. Did they use sighting rods, water basins reflecting stars, or long corridors acting as sightlines? Some theories suggest they tracked shadows over generations, refining their measurements through patient observation. Others speculate that their myths themselves carried mnemonic codes, stories that guided observation over centuries. Whatever the method, the results speak for themselves. Temples that measure Venus, pyramids that track solstices, stairways that sing with sound. Imagine yourself in one of these cities at dawn. The air is cool, filled with the scent of wet leaves. The crowd gathers, not restless but calm, as if they too are instruments waiting for a note. The first ray of sunlight breaks the horizon, threading through a gap between temples, striking a stela inscribed with glyphs. In that instant, the city becomes alive with affirmation. Time has turned as it should. The gods have kept their rhythm. You feel the warmth of the light on your skin, and in the silence of the crowd, you sense not fear, but belonging. The cosmos has included you in its dance. Quirky testimonies from missionaries reveal how deeply these experiences disturbed them. One described the temples as organs of stone, comparing them to church instruments that produced sound. Another confessed he could not sleep after witnessing a solstice alignment, because he felt as though the very stones had spoken. They were used to cathedrals that reached upward, drawing eyes toward heaven, but these pyramids did something different. They pulled heaven downward, embedding it in the daily life of the people. The sky was not distant, it was domesticated, housed in stairways and corridors of stone. Debated still is the interpretation of these rituals. Were they scientific, designed purely to measure celestial cycles? Or were they religious, expressions of myth acted out in stone and shadow? The truth is likely both. For the Maya, science and story were never divided. To measure Venus was to honor a god. To mark the solstice was to renew creation. The temples were laboratories and cathedrals at once, their instruments tuned not to separate knowledge but to unify it. As centuries passed, many of these structures fell into ruin. Trees grew through stairways, roots split stones, yet even in decay, their alignments persist. Archaeologists, standing with modern instruments, have confirmed what the ancients already knew. The sun still rises where it should, Venus still traces its path, shadows still fall on carvings as designed. The stones, though silent, continue to measure time. And from these silent witnesses, the story begins to turn toward human choices, toward fear and fire, toward the decision of one man who believed such knowledge too dangerous to survive. The year 1562 approaches, and with it the crackle of flames in a Yucatan square where codices are piled and set alight. But even as the fire consumes ink and parchment, fragments escape, whispers endure, and the serpent continues its slow descent across the stairways of stone. By the early 17th century, long after the first shock of conquest had passed, the echoes of Maya knowledge continued to unsettle those who tried to contain it. Letters traveled between friars, scholars, and colonial administrators, written in cautious tones, their words carefully chosen as if too much honesty might draw suspicion. One of these letters, dated to 1624 and attributed to a cleric named Father Alvarez, has survived in fragmentary form. It speaks not of battles or conversions, but of temples described as if they were instruments. "These are not houses of worship," the friar wrote, "but instruments of time, organs of light and silence. They are tuned to the sun as one might tune a harp to strings." It was a startling metaphor. For him, the temple was not architecture, but music. The shafts of light that pierced narrow openings at solstice became notes. The shadows that marched across stairways became measures of rhythm. He described walking into a chamber so dark that his eyes struggled, then watching as a single beam struck a glyph on the wall. The silence of the waiting crowd, he noted, was itself part of the performance. An intentional pause, a rest in the score of cosmic music. For a man raised within stone cathedrals where choirs sang and organs thundered, the quiet resonance of Maya ritual was both beautiful and disturbing. A quirky detail in his letter lingers in memory. He claimed that at one moment, just as the beam of light touched the glyph, a bird outside began to call. Its cry echoed through the chamber, amplified by stone, so that the entire room seemed to vibrate. It was as though the building itself had sung, he wrote. Whether this was chance or design, whether the bird simply happened to cry at that moment, we cannot know. But to him it confirmed that the temple was not dead matter. It was alive, resonant, an instrument tuned to the cosmos. The letter, however, did not circulate widely. Alvarez sent it to a superior, who returned it with a note in the margin, transfer to restricted files. Some historians argue this was simply bureaucratic, that unusual observations were set aside for later study. Others insist it was deliberate suppression, an attempt to hide evidence that the Maya possessed knowledge uncomfortably close to sacred domains. The truth remains debated, but the effect was the same. The letter was tucked away, copied only in fragments, its original eventually lost. What survives are phrases scattered across references in later inventories, pieced together like shards of pottery. Imagine yourself as Alvarez, standing in that dark chamber. The air is cool and heavy with incense. You hear the faint murmur of people breathing around you. The silence stretches until it is almost unbearable. Then the beam enters, sharp and golden, cutting through dust to strike a carved glyph. The crowd exhales softly, a sound like wind moving through leaves. In that instant, you feel you are no longer in control. The building, the sky, the people, all are moving together in one rhythm, a rhythm you cannot command. You return to your desk to write, but your words stumble between awe and caution. To call a temple an instrument of time is both praise and confession, an admission that the so-called pagans may know more of the heavens than you wish to believe. Quirky echoes of this same idea appear in other records of the century. A missionary in Guatemala described hearing stone voices when wind blew through temple corridors, a sound that reminded him of organ pipes. Another wrote of stairways that seemed to pulse with light at certain hours, as if breathing. Such metaphors suggest that Europeans encountering these places reached instinctively for the language of music and life. The stones were not mute, they performed. Yet debate continues among modern historians about the reliability of these reports. Some argue that friars exaggerated, seeking to dramatize their experiences for patrons in Europe. Others believe the descriptions were literal, capturing genuine phenomena of light and acoustic. The bird's cry, the hiss of wind, the silent crowd, all could be dismissed as coincidence. But when multiple accounts, scattered across decades, repeat the same images, the argument for intention grows stronger. The Maya did not separate myth from architecture. Their temples were instruments designed to make the cosmos audible and visible, to turn silence into meaning. The suppression of Alvarez's letter illustrates the tension that lingered. To acknowledge that temples played with light and shadow like organs was to grant the Maya a science that rivaled European knowledge. Better perhaps to dismiss them as idolaters, their rituals as empty superstition. Yet the silence of archives cannot fully erase the resonance of stone. Even hidden, the metaphors continued to echo, resurfacing in later reports, whispered by those who could not forget what they had seen. Imagine again that moment centuries ago when the friar bent over his parchment, his candle flickering, his hand hesitant. He writes of silence, of light, of a chamber that seemed to sing. He knows the words may trouble his superiors, yet he cannot erase what he felt. He sends the letter, and in return receives only caution, only silence. The parchment is folded, sealed, and locked away. Outside, the stars turn above the jungle as they always have, indifferent to suppression, patient with time. The image of the temple as an instrument remains one of the most haunting legacies of these early reports. It suggests a worldview where architecture was not inert, but participatory, where buildings conversed with the sky. For the Maya, this was not metaphor, but practice. The temple was a partner in ritual, a machine of stone that played the cosmos. For the friars who witnessed it, the experience blurred the boundary between faith and fear, leaving them with words that would be hidden but not forgotten. From this image of music and silence, the story bends toward fire. For if temples could play with light, then books could sing with knowledge. And in 1562, long before Alvarez set pen to parchment, Diego de Landa had already decided that such songs were dangerous. He gathered codices in the square at Mani and fed them to flames. Yet even from that fire, fragments would survive, drifting into the hands of those who would later write of serpents and cycles. The next step in this story is ash, the glow of parchment turning to embers, the silence of knowledge replaced by the crackle of burning skin and ink. The year was 1562, and the small town of Mani in Yucatan prepared for a spectacle that would not be forgotten. The square filled with smoke, not from incense or offerings, but from fire kindled by the hands of a bishop determined to cleanse what he considered corruption. Diego de Landa, a Franciscan missionary and later bishop of Yucatan, gathered the painted codices of the Maya, their books of bark and deer hide, folded accordion style, covered in glyphs that traced not only prayers, but calendars, rituals, and histories. He piled them high, alongside carved idols, and ordered them burned. "We found many books of these characters," he wrote later, "and since they contained nothing but superstitions and falsehoods of the devil, we burned them all. What was lost that day can never be measured. The codices were more than texts. They were living libraries of cycles, charts of eclipses, tables of Venus, genealogies of rulers, myths of creation and destruction. Written with brushes of hair dipped in pigments of indigo and red, they carried the rhythm of centuries. To consign them to fire was to silence voices that spoke across time. Only a handful survived, smuggled away, hidden or overlooked. The Dresden Codex, the Madrid Codex, the Paris Codex, and fragments of others. All the rest curled in flame, their glyphs turning to smoke, their wisdom to ash. Quirky details cling to the stories of that day. Witnesses claimed the books crackled with unusual sounds as they burned, as if protesting. One friar noted that the smoke rose in thick coils, forming shapes he could not ignore, snakes twisting upward, dissolving into the sky. Whether imagination or omen, the image haunted him. Others said the Maya onlookers wept silently, not only for the loss of objects but for the collapse of continuity. To them the codices were threads binding present to past and future. With each page that turned to ash, a thread snapped, leaving the cycle frayed. Debate persists among historians about how many codices were destroyed. Some argue that hundreds were burned, others suggest dozens. The truth is elusive, buried in vague accounts and lost records. Yet even conservative estimates make the loss catastrophic. Imagine if in Europe in one night nearly every manuscript of antiquity had been destroyed, leaving only 3 or 4 to represent all of Homer, Plato, and the astronomers. That was the scale of devastation inflicted upon Maya memory in the square at Mani. De Landa himself remains a figure of contradiction. He destroyed the codices, yet later compiled his own Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán, a detailed account of Maya culture, language, and belief. Through it, modern scholars have recovered fragments of the very knowledge he helped erase. He recorded the Maya glyphs with painstaking care, though he misunderstood their complexity, believing them to be an alphabet rather than a system of syllables and logograms. His writings became a key centuries later when scholars like Yuri Norosov began deciphering the script. Thus, the same man who consigned countless books to flames unwittingly preserved the seed for their rediscovery. Imagine the square that night. The air is thick with heat, the flames dancing high, sparks floating upward like fireflies. The crackle of parchment echoes against the stone walls of nearby houses. A crowd gathers in uneasy silence, the orange light flickering across their faces. Some cross themselves, believing they witness purification. Others watch in grief, their hands clenched at their sides, knowing that their history, their science, their myths are vanishing into smoke. The bishop stands near the fire, his face illuminated, his eyes reflecting the blaze. He believes he is saving souls. In truth, he is erasing memory. Quirky traces of survival whisper from this night of fire. Stories tell of a few codices hidden in caves, sealed in clay jars. Others suggest that some were carried secretly to Europe, tucked in trunks by curious collectors. Whether these tales are true or folklore is still debated. What is certain is that fragments survived where they should not have, defying the flames. The Dresden Codex, for example, would later be found in a German library, its pages filled with astronomical tables, so precise they could predict eclipses. That one codex, rescued from oblivion, became a bridge across centuries, proof of what had been lost. The debate over De Landa's motives is equally complex. Was he a zealot, convinced that every glyph was demonic? Or was he a pragmatic missionary, using destruction as a tool of conversion? His later writings suggest guilt, a recognition that the fire had consumed more than idols. In one passage, he acknowledged that the books contained matters of great antiquity and subtlety. But by then it was too late. The ashes had scattered, the knowledge dispersed on the wind. Imagine walking through that square after the fire had burned down. The ground is littered with blackened fragments, curls of deer, hide, brittle as dried leaves. If you stoop to pick one up, it crumbles in your hand, leaving only a smear of ash on your fingers. The night is quiet now, the crowd gone, the stars above indifferent. Yet in that silence, you feel the absence, a weight heavier than the fire's smoke, the silence of knowledge erased. From the ashes, however, fragments would resurface. A page here, a codex there, a glyph preserved in memory. And even as the official narrative claimed destruction, whispers suggested that not everything had been lost. Some codices, it was said, were carried secretly to Rome, locked in cabinets where only select eyes could see them. Others may have travelled further, hidden in collections that would resurface centuries later. Whether myth or truth, these whispers gave rise to suspicion that the Vatican itself held pieces of the Maya cycle, preserved not out of reverence, but out of fear. The fire of 1562 stands as both tragedy and paradox. It silenced hundreds of voices, yet it amplified others. It erased codices, yet it preserved fragments through De Landa's writings. It sought to destroy a cyclical understanding of time, yet it became one more cycle in history: destruction, survival, renewal. The serpent, devoured by flame, would later re-emerge in fragments of codex and in the alignments of stone temples that fire could not touch. And so from the embers of that night, the story coils forward again. The 17th century brings new reports of rituals spiraling in patterns, of dreams recorded in margins, of eclipses charted with eerie precision. The silence left by fire is soon broken by voices that continue to speak, if only in whispers, carrying the cycle onward. In the years after the fires of Mani, silence seemed to hang over Yucatan like a pall of smoke. The codices were gone, yet their memory lingered, and whispers of rituals continued to reach the ears of missionaries and officials. By the early 17th century, a new rhythm of accounts began to appear, descriptions not of battles or burnings, but of ceremonies that wound themselves like spirals, repeating motions that seemed to mirror the turning of the heavens. These rituals, carried out in villages far from the gaze of colonial squares, spoke of resilience, of memory that refused to vanish even when its books had been reduced to ash. One such account describes a ceremony at Lake Atitlan in the Guatemalan highlands. Witnesses wrote of dancers circling in great spirals, moving inward toward a central fire, and then outward again, as if imitating the cycles of breath itself. The pattern was mesmerizing, a slow coil that seemed to draw participants into a trance. Observers noted that the movement coincided with lunar phases, the spirals tightening on nights of the new moon, loosening under the full. For the Maya, the spiral was more than dance. It was the architecture of time, enacted with bodies when books were no longer permitted. A quirky fragment appears in the margin of a missionary's diary dated 1639. The writer, known only as Brother Alonso, recorded a dream. In it he saw a great calendar wheel burning, its glyphs glowing like embers. Around the wheel, people moved in spirals, their faces indistinct, their voices silent. He woke shaken, and in his diary he noted, "The fire does not consume, it turns." The line stands out because it echoes the very motif the Maya had long carried, that cycles do not end, they renew. Whether the dream was shaped by guilt, fear, or an unconscious absorption of the rituals he had witnessed, it reveals how deeply the spiral had entered even the minds of those sent to erase it. Debate surrounds the reliability of these accounts. Some historians argue that the descriptions of spiral rituals were colored by European imagination, seeking to portray the Maya as exotic and strange. Others point to the consistency across multiple reports: circles around fires, spirals traced on the ground, dancers moving in time with celestial events. Archaeological evidence adds weight: carvings of spiral motifs, glyphs representing coils of serpents, and murals depicting figures encircling one another. The spiral, both in art and in ritual, was undeniably central. The question is not whether it existed, but how it was understood. Imagine yourself at Lake Atitlan standing on the shore as dusk deepens. The water reflects the glow of torches, mountains rise dark against the sky, and a circle of dancers moves slowly, their footsteps soft on the earth. They turn inward, the spiral tightening, their shadows converging toward the central fire. The flames crackle, throwing sparks into the night. Then, as the spiral tightens to its smallest point, the dancers reverse, unwinding outward, releasing the breath of time. Watching, you feel not a performance, but a pulse, as if the earth itself has inhaled and exhaled. The spiral is no longer abstraction, it is rhythm, visible and audible, embodied in motion. Another curious note comes from a Jesuit report in the 1640s, which forbade the use of certain phrases in indigenous prayers, especially those that referred to descending from the sky or turning of the road above. Officials insisted these words were dangerous, suggesting connections to cycles beyond the acceptable framework of Christian liturgy. The prohibition itself reveals recognition. The missionaries had noticed that these phrases carried cosmological meaning, tying rituals to the heavens, and they sought to silence them. Yet prohibitions rarely erase belief. More often they drive it deeper, into dreams, into whispers, into spiral dances held at night along lake shores. By the late 17th century, another record appears, dated 1679, describing Kukulkan, the feathered serpent, and linking his return with a count that led toward the distant year 2012. The document, later stored under lock and key, suggested that rituals of spiral movement were not only symbolic, but calendrical, counting down cycles within cycles. Whether genuine or apocryphal, it reflects the persistence of the spiral as a marker of time. The serpent coils, the dancer's coil, the calendar coils. Each turn is both continuation and renewal, a path that returns but never to the same place. Debate continues over the dream of Brother Alonso. Was it simply a fevered imagination, or did it echo visions shared among those who witnessed the rituals? Some argue that his phrase, "the fire does not consume, it turns," was too close to Maya cosmology to be coincidence. Perhaps he had heard it spoken, perhaps it lingered from a sermon translated into native tongue, or perhaps in dreaming he touched the rhythm of the cycle without intending to. Dreams, after all, are spirals themselves, circling memory and fear until they merge into images that cannot be fully explained. Imagine for a moment that you are Alonso, waking in the middle of the night, sweat on your brow, the image of a burning calendar still vivid. You sit at your desk by candlelight, ink trembling on your quill. You write quickly, almost compulsively, then hesitate, unsure whether to leave the words or erase them. At last, you let them stand, tucked into the margin where perhaps no one will see. Yet centuries later, readers will find your note, a faint echo of a dream that carried the weight of cycles you could not understand. The spiral rituals of the 17th century revealed that the Maya worldview persisted even under pressure. The fire of 1562 had consumed books, but it could not consume bodies moving in patterns, voices singing in circles, dreams spinning coils of flame. The cycle endured, shifting forms, adapting to silence, yet always returning. And in these returns lay both resilience and mystery. For those who tried to suppress it, the spiral was unsettling. For those who lived it, the spiral was life. From these dances, from dreams scribbled in margins, from prohibitions that could not erase, the story moves toward new reckoning. The 17th century would bring not only spiral rituals, but more precise accounts of celestial cycles, tables of eclipses, charts of the moon, inscriptions that seemed to anticipate dates far into the future. And in one such account, preserved in 1670, the serpent's coil would tighten again, linking sky and stone in ways that left even skeptical scholars uneasy. The path of the spiral thus turns onward, from ritual to record, from dream to calculation, carrying the cycle into its next breath. The 17th century produced many documents whose margins still glimmer with mystery, but few are as puzzling as the records attributed to a man called Lorenzo Bruni, or sometimes, in other spellings, Bruni or Bruni E. His name drifts through the archives like smoke, sometimes Jesuit, sometimes Franciscan, sometimes nothing more than a signature on a brittle page. Scholars are unsure if he ever lived as described, or if later scribes attached a name to work that would otherwise have been anonymous. What matters is the text linked to him, a series of tables copied around 1670 that appear to chart eclipses of the sun and moon across centuries. These tables by themselves are unremarkable if viewed with modern eyes. They list intervals, numbers that correspond to cycles long known to astronomy, the Saros cycle, the repetition of lunar and solar eclipses every 18 years or so. But what startled later readers was how neatly these numbers aligned not only with eclipses of the distant past, but also with events in the far future. Among them, the dates of 684 CE and 1991 CE stand out, years when significant eclipses were visible in the Maya region. The implication was that the records preserved knowledge that stretched beyond observation into prediction. A quirky note scribbled in the margin of one such table reads, "Either they see farther than we, or another hand shows them." The line suggests unease, even suspicion, as though the compiler himself could not decide whether the accuracy belonged to the Maya or to some hidden instructor. It is the kind of sentence that fuels centuries of speculation, spawning theories of lost sciences or contact with mysterious teachers. Yet stripped of embellishment, it still reveals awe. The recognition that a system of cycles tracked faithfully could anticipate eclipses across vast spans of time. Debate continues about the authenticity of these tables. Some argue they were not truly Maya, but reconstructions by Europeans, attempts to fit local myths into familiar astronomical frameworks. Others counter that the consistency of numbers across different manuscripts suggests genuine transmission from indigenous sources. The truth likely lies in a mixture. European scribes copying, adapting, perhaps misunderstanding, but working from older materials whose origins were Maya. The survival of such documents, even in partial form, is itself remarkable given the destruction of codices a century earlier. Imagine the moment of copying. A friar sits at a wooden desk in a dim room, candlelight flickering over parchment. He traces numbers into columns, his pen scratching steadily. Outside, the jungle hums with cicadas. He pauses, squints at the glyphs in his source, and translates them into his own notations. As he writes, he feels unease. The intervals repeat with precision. The pattern does not falter. He realizes that if he projects forward, he can anticipate eclipses decades, even centuries ahead. His hand trembles slightly. To him, such foresight belongs to God, not to those considered pagans. Yet the numbers speak plainly, as inexorable as shadow crossing the moon. Quirky fragments accompany these tables, small notes that reveal the copyist's state of mind. One page includes a faint sketch of a serpent coiled around a circle, its tail touching its mouth. Another contains the word restrictus, written hastily in the corner, as if to mark the document for limited eyes. Still another shows smudges as though a drop of sweat or ink had blurred the numbers, the human hand betraying its own anxiety. These details remind us that even in the act of preservation, fear hovered. The tables were copied not with celebration, but with caution, as if they carried a power too sharp to leave in open view. Modern historians argue about whether the 1991 eclipse in particular was truly anticipated by these 17th century tables, or whether later readers projected the connection backward. On July 11th of that year, one of the most spectacular solar eclipses of the 20th century crossed Mexico, casting cities into sudden night. The coincidence that Bruni's tables included cycles that matched such dates is tantalizing. Was it foresight, or simply the inevitability of cycles repeating so that any long enough record will eventually align? The debate has no simple resolution, but it illustrates the enduring tension between skepticism and wonder. Imagine being present at that eclipse of 1991, centuries after Bruni wrote. The streets darken, birds fall silent, the air cools as if twilight has descended at midday. Crowds gasp, some fearful, some awestruck. The sun's corona flares, a halo of fire around absence. In that moment you remember the tables, the neat numbers scratched in fading ink, and realize that someone in a candlelit room 3 centuries earlier had glimpsed this event in the turning of cycles. You feel yourself standing inside a spiral that stretches across time, linking the 17th century to the 20th, linking parchment to sky. Debate also lingers over who Bruni truly was. Was he a missionary sincerely attempting to record Maya knowledge? Was he a European scholar imposing his own framework on unfamiliar glyphs? Or was he an invention, a name attached to anonymous fragments to lend them authority? Each possibility changes how we read the tables. If he was real, his awe and fear become part of the story. If he was a construct, then the story shifts toward the power of archives to shape truth through attribution. Either way, the numbers remain, stubborn in their precision, carrying the echo of cycles that outlast identities. Quirky anecdotes from later centuries suggest that copies of Bruni's tables were stored in cabinets requiring multiple keys to open, 3 locks for 3 guardians, as one inventory described. This detail, whether literal or figurative, adds to the aura of secrecy. It suggests that those who handled the manuscripts considered them sensitive, perhaps too disruptive to circulate freely. Was it the accuracy of eclipses that frightened them, or the implication that knowledge could survive beyond conquest? The serpent coiled around the circle, tail touching mouth, seemed to embody that fear. Knowledge devoured itself, yet endured. Imagine yourself holding one of those manuscripts now. The paper is brittle, edges darkened by age. The ink has faded but remains legible, numbers marching in columns like footsteps. You trace them with your eyes, realizing they leap across centuries, tying past to future. A whisper of anxiety rises within you. If cycles can be projected forward so easily, what does it mean for human freedom? Are we actors in a predetermined script, or dancers in a spiral whose pattern is known long before we step onto the stage? The question unsettles, not because of superstition, but because of the inexorable mathematics of repetition. From these tables, from the uneasy hand of Bruni or whoever bore his name, the story coils forward again. It leads toward another document found decades later that speaks not only of eclipses but of countdowns, of a spiral leading to a distant date, 2012. There in the late 17th century, the serpent tightens its coil once more, preparing to strike not in destruction but in renewal. The fire of Mani had not erased the cycle, the spiral of rituals had not forgotten it. And now, in ink and number, the count continued, waiting for a future it would never see but that we would inherit. The year 1679 surfaces in scattered references, a date often whispered in connection with a document that spoke of Kukulkan, the feathered serpent, and a count that stretched forward to a time unimaginably distant for its readers. This record, preserved only in fragments and copies, has been called one of the most unsettling pieces in the collection of colonial archives. Unlike the tables of eclipses that could be explained by mathematics, this text was drenched in symbolism, yet it carried within it a number that drew attention, a countdown leading not to the 17th or 18th century, but far beyond, to the year 2012. The manuscript itself is elusive. Some claim it was a letter carried from Guatemala to Rome. Others say it was compiled locally by missionaries translating indigenous testimony. Its descriptions were enigmatic, a serpent coiling around a stairway, each loop marked with glyphs that corresponded to great cycles of time. At the serpent's mouth was written a date, translated by later hands into the year 2012. To the Maya, this may have signified nothing more than the completion of a baktun, the turning of a cycle. To Europeans, reading with linear eyes, it looked like prophecy, a countdown to an end. A quirky image haunts the accounts of how this document was stored. One inventory notes that it was placed in a cabinet requiring 3 keys to open, each held by a different guardian. Only when all 3 were present could the drawer be unlocked. The symbolism is impossible to ignore. 3 locks for one secret, 3 guardians for one serpent's coil. Was this literal procedure or a metaphor for restriction? The detail is debated, yet its persistence in multiple references suggests that the document carried weight, that it was considered dangerous enough to limit access. Imagine the scene in which a missionary first recorded this spiral. Perhaps he sat among villagers, watching a ritual dance in which participants moved inward, circling a fire, each step counting time. He asked what the dance meant, and an elder pointed to the sky, tracing a spiral with his finger, then touched the earth and drew another coil in dust. The missionary scribbled notes, trying to fix the image in words he barely understood. Later, when he translated the glyphs, he realized they stretched forward, a measure of cycles that ended in a year his calendar rendered as 2012. For him, the number was ominous, uncomfortably precise, a thread tying distant future to mythic serpent. Debate rages over the authenticity of this 1679 record. Some scholars dismiss it as apocryphal, arguing that later interpreters imposed the date retroactively. reading modern anxieties into older texts. Others point to consistent motifs: the spiral, the serpent, the number of cycles. Even if the exact date of 2012 was not inscribed, the presence of a long count leading to a distant turning is plausible. The Maya calendar naturally invited such extrapolation. Each back-tune rolled into the next, each coil of the serpent following from the one before. To read a future date was not prophecy but arithmetic. Yet for Europeans in 1679, the arithmetic felt like omen. Quirky anecdotes surround the fate of the document. Some say it was filed in a drawer labelled Cave Tres Clavis. Beware, 3 keys. Others suggest it was read aloud in a small circle of Jesuits, who debated whether it should be copied or destroyed. One account claims that a bishop, after hearing the number 2012, crossed himself and ordered silence. Another insists that a copy was made and smuggled out, only to vanish into private hands. The very uncertainty of these stories adds to their aura. Each retelling coils like the serpent itself, winding truth and rumor together until they are indistinguishable. Imagine yourself as one of those guardians of the keys. You stand before the cabinet in a dim archive, the air dry with the smell of parchment. 2 others arrive, each carrying a key. Together you unlock the drawer, the click of tumblers echoing like distant bells. Inside lies the manuscript, its pages brittle, its ink faded but legible. You open it, tracing the spiral of glyphs, your finger moving slowly until it rests at the serpent's mouth, at the date marked there. The number chills you. You glance at the others. No words are spoken, but all feel the weight of time pressing forward, far beyond your lifespans into a future none of you will see. You close the drawer, turn the keys, and walk away in silence. Modern scholars sifting through references to this record debate its implications. Was the date of 2012 truly present, or did later interpreters impose it? If it was present, was it meant as prophecy or simply as marker of a cycle's completion? The arguments spiral endlessly, mirroring the subject itself. Yet regardless of interpretation, the persistence of the motif, the serpent, the spiral, the countdown, reveals a deep continuity. The Maya vision of time endured in ritual, in stone, in fragmentary records, surfacing even in the guarded archives of 17th century Europe. A quirky reflection appears in the diary of a traveller who heard of the document second-hand. He wrote of dreaming of a serpent coiled in darkness, its body covered in numbers, its eyes glowing like eclipses. When he woke, he felt convinced that the serpent was not threatening but patient, waiting. The dream may have been nothing more than imagination stirred by rumor, yet it echoes the tone of the record itself, not destruction, but waiting for renewal. Debate about prophecy and cycle reveals more about European minds than Maya ones. For the Maya, time was always turning. To mark 2012 was no more extraordinary than to mark any other completion of a baktun. For Europeans, however, conditioned to think of history as linear, the date looked final, like a wall at the end of a road. The clash of perspectives, spiral versus line, haunted the interpretation of the record. Was the serpent's mouth the end of the world, or simply the place where it swallowed its tail to begin again? Imagine now the atmosphere of 1679. The jungle beyond the villages hums with cicadas, the stars wheel overhead. A friar sits at his desk, ink staining his fingers as he copies glyphs into Latin letters. His candle burns low, shadows stretching across the walls. He pauses, stares at the number he has written, and feels a tremor of unease. He cannot grasp the future it represents, but he knows it lies beyond his control. He closes his book, whispers a prayer, and leaves the rest to silence. From this record of countdown and serpent, the story flows onward. It leads not only through cycles of time, but into the heart of art itself, where motifs of stars and spirals appear in frescoes far from the jungle, painted on ceilings of Rome. There, in the vaults of the Sistine Chapel, some believe echoes of the codices found new life hidden in plain sight. And so, from the secret cabinet of 3 keys, the serpent glides into the brushstrokes of Renaissance masters, coiling once more in unexpected places. The serpent that wound its way through temples and manuscripts did not remain confined to the jungles of Central America. Centuries later, some scholars searching through the art of Europe began to see echoes of the same motifs painted high above their heads. The claim was startling, that in the vaulted ceilings of the Vatican itself, in the Sistine Chapel, painted by Michelangelo, constellations appeared arranged in patterns reminiscent of glyphs preserved in Maya codices. The suggestion was never part of mainstream scholarship, yet it persisted in whispers, in marginal notes, in quiet conversations that blurred the boundary between coincidence and conspiracy. The Codex VZ, discovered centuries after De Landa's fire, its deer-hide pages preserved against expectation, contains among its many drawings a spiral at the center, coiled around a serpent whose eye aligns with a cluster of stars. When this codex reached European hands in the early 20th century, some researchers began to compare it with Renaissance art. They noted a curious detail. One fresco in the Sistine Chapel's ceiling, painted nearly 400 years earlier, contained a similar arrangement of stars, small and easily overlooked, forming the same cluster found in the Codex. The resemblance might have been coincidence, but for those who longed for patterns, it became proof that the cycle had crossed oceans, embedding itself in brushstrokes as well as glyphs. A quirky anecdote haunts this comparison. In the 1970s, a young scholar reportedly presented a paper on the resemblance between the Codex VZ spiral and the star motif in the Sistine Chapel. Within months, she vanished from university records, not literally missing, but reassigned, her credentials withdrawn, her publications suppressed. Colleagues whispered that she had been pressured to abandon her research. Whether true or exaggerated, the story added fuel to the sense of secrecy. The very idea that a Maya codex could resonate with Vatican art was too unsettling to explore openly. Debate among historians centers on the nature of patterns themselves. Humans are wired to find shapes, to connect dots across distance and time. The cluster of stars in the fresco may have been no more than decorative, a flourish in a sky scene painted by Michelangelo. The spiral in the Codex VZ may have been symbolic, representing the coils of the serpent and the turning of time rather than a literal star map. To claim connection risks overreach. Yet the persistence of the motif, spiral, serpent, stars, across continents and centuries, suggests that the resonance cannot be dismissed entirely. Perhaps the link lies not in direct influence, but in shared intuition that cycles, coils, and stars form a universal language of time. Imagine yourself lying on the floor of the Sistine Chapel, your gaze drifting upward. The ceiling stretches above like a firmament of color, filled with figures, gestures, and ornaments. Among them, almost hidden, a small pattern of stars emerges, painted so lightly you might miss it if you blink. Now imagine holding the Codex VZ in your hands, its pages smelling faintly of leather and smoke, the serpent spiraling across the surface, its eye fixed on the same cluster. You feel the echo between the two, an uncanny resonance across centuries. Is it evidence, or only the mind's desire to weave connections? The question hums in your chest like a low organ note, unresolved but insistent. Quirky interpretations have extended further, suggesting that Michelangelo may have embedded celestial motifs throughout his work. Some art historians argue that the very shape of God's cloak in the creation of Adam resembles the human brain, a symbol of hidden knowledge. If such coded symbolism existed, why not star patterns? Yet skeptics caution against seeing too much. Renaissance artists worked within a rich symbolic vocabulary, drawing from classical myth, astrology, and theology. The resemblance to Maya codices may be no more than accident. The Codex Vizir itself may not even be authentically ancient in every part. Some scholars argue that portions could have been redrawn or reinterpreted during the colonial period. The debate reveals the tension between imagination and evidence. On one side, the thrill of discovery, patterns that leap across oceans, whispers that connect temples to chapels, codices to frescoes. On the other, the rigor of caution, coincidence, misinterpretation, projection. Yet even if the connection is unproven, the very act of comparison reveals something important. It shows how deeply the motifs of spiral and serpent resonate, how easily they emerge in art and story, how persistently they haunt the human imagination. Imagine, too, the atmosphere of secrecy that surrounded such discussions. A scholar presents her theory, is met with polite silence, then finds doors quietly closing around her. She withdraws her paper, shelves her notes, and moves on to safer topics. Meanwhile, in private conversations, her ideas continue to circulate, whispered like forbidden songs. The pattern in the ceiling remains, the spiral in the Codex endures, and those who look closely cannot help but wonder if the resemblance means more than coincidence. Quirky fragments of correspondence echo this sense of suppression. A letter from the mid-20th century describes images withdrawn for review after a researcher submitted photographs comparing Maya codices with Renaissance art. Another note mentions excessive speculation leading to disciplinary action. These phrases may mask nothing more sinister than academic caution, but to those who crave mystery, they sound like locks clicking shut. The serpent coils tighter, its body winding not only through temples and manuscripts, but through universities and archives, leaving silence in its wake. Debate persists in modern circles. Is it worthwhile to pursue such connections, or does it only distract from genuine understanding of Maya knowledge? Some argue that by reaching for Renaissance parallels, we risk diminishing the originality of Maya cosmology. Others counter that symbols live beyond boundaries, that cycles and spirals belong to all cultures, and that seeing them in unexpected places only deepens appreciation for their universality. The serpent, after all, is not confined to one tradition. It slithers through myths of Greece and India, through Norse sagas and Chinese dragons. Why should it not appear in the Sistine Chapel, whether by accident or design? Imagine yourself walking alone in the Sistine Chapel at night, the tourists gone, the silence profound. Only the echo of your footsteps disturbs the stillness. You look up, tracing the figures and patterns, the painted sky above. Somewhere, hidden among clouds and cherubs, you find a small cluster of stars. You remember the Codex, the spiral, the serpent's eye. You feel the chill of recognition, the warmth of continuity. For a moment, time coils around you, linking Maya scribes and Renaissance painters, temples and chapels, ashes and frescoes. The cycle turns in paint as well as stone. From these echoes in art, the story moves forward into the modern era. The cycle does not remain in archives or on ceilings. It emerges again in the 20th century when telescopes are turned to the sky and questions resurface about what the Maya truly knew. And on one night in 2012, in a desert observatory owned by the Vatican, a telescope was silenced deliberately, as if to avoid witnessing the culmination of cycles. From codices to chapels to instruments of glass and metal, the serpent continues its path, carrying the question forward. Among the surviving relics of Maya knowledge, few are as enigmatic as the Codex VZ. Bound in deer hide, folded like an accordion, its pages are stained with time, their pigments faded but not lost. Unlike the codices consumed in the fires of Mani, this one endured, surfacing in the early 20th century in circumstances that remain unclear. Some say it was discovered in a private collection in Mexico. Others claim it had lingered for centuries in a European archive, mislabeled and forgotten. When its pages were finally examined in 1916, scholars were struck by the imagery at its center, a great spiral coiling inward, wrapped around the body of a serpent. At the spiral's heart lay a cluster of stars, and at the serpent's eye, a glyph that some later interpreted as a date, December 21st, 2012. The Codex contains many familiar elements of Maya cosmology: gods with elaborate headdresses, tables of Venus, records of rituals. Yet the spiral image dominates, demanding attention. It seems less like decoration and more like instruction, a diagram of cycles not only celestial, but existential. The serpent winds inward, its coils marked by segments that may correspond to Bactunes. Each loop tightens toward the center, suggesting a countdown. And yet, rather than ending at the middle, the spiral continues outward again, reversing direction, as though time itself were breathing, inhaling and exhaling across eternity. A quirky detail emerges in the Codex's condition. On the page with the spiral, small holes pierce the hide, as if someone long ago had pressed too hard with a stylus, or perhaps pinned the sheet to a surface for display. The holes align with certain points of the spiral, leading some to speculate that the Codex was not merely read, but used as a physical instrument, perhaps placed beneath a beam of light to mark positions. No proof supports this theory, but the idea lingers that the Codex was not only text, but tool, a device that made cycles visible in a way stone temples did with shadow. Debate about the Codex's authenticity has never ceased. Some argue that portions of it may be colonial copies of older originals, drawn by Maya scribes under missionary oversight. Others claim it is entirely genuine, a survivor of the 16th century hidden away until rediscovery. Skeptics even suggest that the spiral was emphasized by modern hands, exaggerated to fit 20th century fascination with 2012. The truth remains unresolved, yet even cautious scholars admit the Codex preserves authentic layers of Maya thought, whether transmitted directly or through the filter of colonial scribes. Imagine holding the Codex in a quiet archive. The room smells of parchment and dust. You unfold the deer-hide pages carefully, their surface soft but brittle at the edges. The spiral emerges, coiling across the page in rich red and black pigment. Your eyes follow its turns, each loop drawing you inward until you reach the center. You feel as though you are falling into the coil, pulled into a rhythm larger than yourself. Then, as you trace the line outward again, you realize the spiral does not end. It continues, reversing direction, breathing you back into the world. The sensation is hypnotic, a visual echo of the cyclical time the Maya inscribed in stone. Quirky anecdotes around the Codex's rediscovery. One story claims that when it was first displayed in a small exhibition, viewers reported dizziness after staring too long at the spiral. Another tells of a curator who dreamed repeatedly of serpents after working with the manuscript, dreams that ended only when he refused to handle the Codex again. Such tales may be exaggerations, yet they illustrate the psychological power of the image. Spirals are among the most ancient of human symbols, appearing in caves, pottery, and petroglyphs around the world. To see one coiled around a serpent in a codex tied to cycles of time is to feel both awe and unease, as though gazing into the machinery of existence itself. Debate about the Codex often turns to the question of 2012. Did the glyph at the serpent's eye truly indicate that date, or was it a later projection? Some scholars argue that the interpretation is forced, that the glyph more likely refers to a mythic event in the deep past, not the future. Others insist that the alignment with the completion of the 13th Baktun is too neat to dismiss. Whether prophecy or arithmetic, the Codex seemed to point toward a hinge of time that modern culture would later obsess over. For the Maya, however, such a hinge was not an apocalypse. It was a turning, a renewal, the serpent swallowing its tail to begin again. Imagine sitting with the Codex late at night, the archive silent around you. The light falls softly on the page, illuminating the spiral. You run your finger lightly over the pigments, feeling the faint texture of paint on hide. As you stare, the spiral seems to move, coiling and uncoiling like a living thing. You close your eyes and still see it, a pattern burned into your vision. You realize that the image has worked its way into you, that you have not simply looked at it, but absorbed it. You feel the breath of cycles in your chest, the slow rhythm of time turning. Quirky echoes of the Codex appear in unexpected places. In one early report, a scholar noted that the spiral reminded him of the structure of galaxies, though the Maya could not have known such forms. Another compared it to the patterns of hurricanes spiraling across the Caribbean, storms that the Maya surely observed and feared. The spiral is universal, appearing in snail shells, whirlpools, the twist of vines. Perhaps that universality explains its power. It is not only a Maya symbol, but a human one, a shape that recurs wherever life encounters cycles of growth and decay. The debate about authenticity may never be resolved, but perhaps it misses the point. The Codex, genuine or hybrid, ancient or colonial, embodies the idea of cycles in a form that compels attention. Whether it predicts or remembers, whether it is science or myth, it captures the essence of Maya time, not an arrow, but a breath. To stare into the spiral is to feel endings dissolve into beginnings, to sense the serpent turning without end. From the pages of the Codex, the story moves outward again, away from manuscripts and into the living world. For just as spirals appeared on deer hide, so too did they echo in the architecture of Europe, in the brushstrokes of Michelangelo, in the whispers of archives. And in 2012, as the solstice sun touched the galactic rift, the spiral seemed to complete one turn of its path. Yet even then, the cycle did not end. It continued, winding into new forms, surfacing in telescopes and in silences more deliberate than any fire. From Codex to cosmos, the serpent still coils, carrying us into the next moment. The Codex VZ'd, with its spiral of the serpent, did not remain confined to archives. Its imagery found strange echoes in places that seemed impossibly distant. In the very heart of Europe, painted across walls meant to celebrate triumphs of faith. Some scholars, working quietly in the 20th century, noticed motifs in Vatican art that seemed to correspond uncannily to symbols within the Codex. Chief among these was the Sistine Chapel ceiling, where amid prophets and sibyls, among panels of Genesis and Judgment, there appeared constellations and clusters of stars arranged in ways that recalled the spiral countdown. One researcher, poring over photographs of the Codex VZ and Michelangelo's frescoes side by side, drew connections that were difficult to dismiss. In both, a serpent winds through the composition. In the Codex, the serpent coils around a spiral, its eye fixed on a cluster of stars. In the chapel, painted centuries earlier, a serpent curls around the figure of Eve, its body twisting in a way that seems to echo the same pattern. This might be mere coincidence. After all, serpents are common in myth, but the unsettling detail was the arrangement of stars in the background, a cluster resembling the Pleiades, placed almost exactly where the Codex located its spiral's heart. A quirky story circulated about one of these researchers, a woman who presented her findings at a small academic gathering in the 1960s. She spoke of spiral counts, serpent motifs, and constellations hidden in the chapel's painted skies. Her presentation was met with polite nods, followed by a strange silence. Within months, her academic post was withdrawn. No explanation was given, but her colleagues whispered that she had touched a nerve. Some claimed she had been warned that her comparisons were unhelpful. Whether true or exaggerated, the story grew in the retelling. The woman had seen too much, and for that she was silenced. Debate about these correspondences continues to this day. Skeptics argue that the Sistine Chapel's star clusters are too vague to be meaningful, that the resemblances arise from human pattern-seeking. They point out that serpents, spirals, and stars appear in countless traditions, Greek, Hebrew, Mesopotamian, and that to link Michelangelo's brush directly to Maya glyphs is historically implausible. Yet others maintain that knowledge traveled in ways we do not fully grasp. Traders, sailors, and missionaries carried stories across oceans long before official records. A glyph here, a motif there, perhaps fragments of Maya cosmology filtered into Europe, not enough to be recognized, but enough to be painted unconsciously into mythic scenes. Imagine yourself standing alone in the Sistine Chapel, the tourists gone, the silence profound. The air is cool, smelling faintly of wax and stone. Above you spreads Michelangelo's masterpiece, its colors dimmed by centuries, yet still vibrant. Your eyes drift upward, tracing the figures, the gestures, the twisting serpent. Then, almost hidden, you notice a cluster of stars painted in pale gold. The pattern pricks your memory. You have seen it before on the deer-hide pages of the Codex VZ. The recognition chills you, though you cannot prove the connection. You feel as if the serpent has coiled across oceans, embedding itself in fresco as well as glyph. Quirky fragments in Vatican correspondence suggest that such parallels were noticed long before the 20th century. One marginal note in an 18th century inventory refers cryptically to constellations inappropriate to the subject matter. Another mentions a daunting resemblance between a codex in restricted storage and figures in the chapel. These comments were brief, veiled, never expanded upon, yet they hint that the possibility of connection was not entirely ignored, even if never acknowledged openly. Debate among art historians has occasionally flared when such claims resurface. Some insist that to see Maya motifs in the Sistine Chapel is to undermine the Renaissance context, replacing history with fantasy. Others counter that symbolism is never confined, that artists draw unconsciously from a reservoir of archetypes that transcend geography. The serpent eating its tail, the spiral of time, the cluster of stars. These are not the property of one culture, but the inheritance of many. Whether Michelangelo ever encountered Maya symbols is less important, they argue, than the fact that both traditions reached for the same images to describe the turning of existence. Imagine the scholar in the 1960s who dared to present her findings. She stands at a lectern in a small conference hall, her slides projecting the Codex spiral beside the fresco serpent. She explains calmly, pointing out similarities in form, in placement, in meaning. The audience listens, some intrigued, some skeptical. Afterward, she returns to her desk only to find her project quietly stalled, her funding withdrawn. She walks through the city at night, her notes tucked under her arm, knowing she has seen something she cannot unsee. Whether she was silenced by design or by indifference, her discovery coils onward in rumor, whispered in quiet corners where curiosity persists. Quirky legends cling to this intersection of codex and chapel. One claims that Michelangelo in his youth saw manuscripts brought from Spain that contained curious drawings of the Indians. Another insists that sailors carried tales of temples aligned with the stars, and that such stories found their way into artistic circles. Neither claim is verifiable, but both illustrate how porous cultural boundaries can be. Knowledge travels not only through official channels, but in songs, in sketches, in whispers overheard. The possibility that fragments of Maya cosmology slipped into Renaissance art cannot be proven, but neither can it be dismissed outright. The debate about patterns often circles back to the human need for meaning. We are drawn to spirals, to serpents, to stars, because they mirror the rhythms of life and death, of seasons and generations. Whether painted on deer hide in Yucatan or plaster in Rome, they carry the same resonance. Perhaps the connection between Codex VZ and the Sistine Chapel is not historical, but archetypal, an echo of shared intuition across cultures. Yet the fact that scholars noticed the echo and that some were discouraged from pursuing it adds an aura of secrecy that only deepens the mystery. Imagine, finally, the act of looking. You stand with the Codex open on a table, its spiral vivid in red and black. You lift your gaze to a reproduction of the Sistine ceiling, its serpent coiling in pale green. The two images blur in your mind until they overlap, serpent upon serpent, spiral upon spiral. You feel the weight of centuries collapse into one moment, a cycle completed, a pattern recognized. The connection may be coincidence, but it feels like destiny. From these echoes in fresco and codex, the story moves toward the modern age. The serpent coils onward, leaving art behind to enter the realm of telescopes and observatories. And in 2012, when the solstice sun touched the galactic rift, the Vatican's own telescope in Arizona fell silent by deliberate hand. The silence of stone, the silence of archives, now became the silence of glass and machine. The serpent turned once more, not in paint or parchment, but in the sky itself. The cycle of the serpent did not end in painted ceilings or forgotten codices. It uncoiled again in the deserts of Arizona, where a modern instrument of glass and steel pointed toward the heavens. The Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, known simply as VAT. Built on Mount Graham, far from the dense glow of cities, the telescope stood as one of the Church's boldest ventures into astronomy. With its precision optics and sweeping view of the skies, it represented a paradox, an institution rooted in theology, reaching ever further into the cosmos. Yet on one night, in December of 2012, the telescope was turned away, its gaze silenced not by failure, but by choice. December 21st of that year had been whispered about for decades. For some, It was a date of doom, the supposed end of the world. For others, it marked transition, the close of one cycle and the opening of another. Scholars argued that the Maya had not predicted catastrophe, only renewal, but the popular imagination clung to apocalyptic visions. As the solstice approached, television programs speculated, books filled shelves, and travelers flocked to Maya ruins to watch the dawn. In Rome, the date was treated with public dismissal. Officials reassured the faithful that nothing would happen, that life would continue as usual. Yet in Arizona, the Vatican's telescope, prepared to observe the solstice alignment, was deliberately shut down. A quirky account survives in the form of an internal memo, leaked years later. It contained only one enigmatic line: "Tonight we must not look upward, but inward." The decision was not explained, nor was it ever acknowledged officially. But to those who heard of it, the gesture carried weight. Why silence the instrument at the very moment the world was watching the sky? Was it a symbolic act, a rejection of superstition? Or was it caution, an unwillingness to confront the possibility that the Maya cycle had indeed anticipated a rare alignment? Imagine the observatory that night. The desert air is cold, the sky astonishingly clear. Stars glitter with diamond brightness, and the Milky Way stretches overhead like a silver river. Inside the control room, red lights glow faintly. The telescope stands ready, its mirrors polished, its machinery humming softly. Then, with a deliberate motion, the operators power it down. The hum ceases, the dome remains closed, and the great eye of glass is left blind. Outside, the solstice sun sets into alignment with the galactic rift, unseen by the instrument that could have captured it with perfect clarity. The silence of the machine mirrors the silence of archives centuries earlier, when letters were locked away behind 3 keys. Debate about that decision has never been resolved. Some argue it was coincidence, that maintenance or weather concerns justified the closure. Others insist it was deliberate symbolism, a choice meant to deny spectacle to those hungry for prophecy. Still others whisper that the telescope was shut because those in charge feared what might be revealed. Not apocalypse, but confirmation that cycles long recorded in glyphs and stone were more precise than anyone had admitted. The absence of observation became, in its own way, an observation. By refusing to look, the act itself spoke volumes. Quirky anecdotes surround the observatory, even apart from that night. Mount Graham, the mountain where it stands, has long been considered sacred by the Apache people who opposed the telescope's construction. They described it as a place of emergence, a site where spiritual beings dwell. To build an instrument of astronomy there was, to them, a violation. The irony is striking. One sacred cosmology displaced by another, a modern eye to the heavens rising where an indigenous world had already located its sacred sky. The layers of meaning coiled atop one another, like the serpent in the Codex. Imagine standing at the foot of the telescope dome on December 21st, 2012. The air bites with cold, the wind sweeping across the mountain. Inside, the great machine is silent, its gears still, its mirror covered. You tilt your head back and see the stars blazing freely overhead. The galactic rift cuts the Milky Way, dark and immense. The solstice sun has set, completing its passage through the alignment the Maya marked centuries ago. You feel both awe and unease, as though you are watching something forbidden. The telescope remains blind, but your eyes see what they will not record. Debate among historians and astronomers circles endlessly around this gesture of silence. Was it superstition on the part of those who claimed to reject superstition? Was it prudence to avoid being drawn into sensational claims? Or was it, quietly, respect? A recognition that on that night the heavens spoke with a voice older than any telescope, and the wisest response was silence. No clear answer emerges, but the absence itself resonates. In a world obsessed with data, the refusal to look is as powerful as a discovery. Quirky rumors suggest that photographs were taken nonetheless by staff who could not resist the temptation to open the dome after hours. These images, if they exist, have never surfaced publicly. Some claim they were confiscated, others that they remain buried in private collections. Whether myth or fact, the rumor adds another coil to the serpent's body, another layer of secrecy to a night already heavy with meaning. Imagine, years later, researchers debating the event in quiet conferences. They sit around a table, papers spread, voices low. One insists the telescope was closed for maintenance, another counters with a leaked memo. A third remains silent, staring at a reproduction of the Codex VZ spiral. The conversation circles endlessly like the serpent itself. In the end, no agreement is reached, but all feel the weight of the question. Did the Maya truly anticipate the alignment? Did the Vatican fear confirmation? Or was the silence nothing more than human hesitation in the face of mystery? From the silenced telescope, the story spirals outward once more. For the serpent did not vanish in 2012. It continued its coil, moving into reports of unusual celestial events, of red eclipses and delayed dawns, of whispers about signs that matched glyphs long thought forgotten. The cycle had not ended. It had turned again, carrying its questions into the years beyond. And so the path leads forward into those anomalies, into the strange coincidences that followed the night when the Vatican chose not to look. The silence of the telescope in 2012 did not close the story. If anything, it deepened it. For the years that followed carried whispers of anomalies, moments in the sky and on the earth that seemed to echo the cycles preserved in glyphs and codices. These events were not disasters, not the fiery end so many had imagined, but subtle disturbances, slippages in rhythm that left observers unsettled. They were coincidences, perhaps, yet they carried the flavor of prophecy fulfilled, not in destruction, but in strange continuity. One such anomaly occurred in the 17th century, long before 2012. Yet it was remembered in connection with the cycle. In 1631, a total lunar eclipse was described in a letter as the breath of the serpent. The moon turned a deep red, the color of glowing embers, and the friar who recorded it wrote that villagers stood in silence, watching the orb darken. He noted that their chants rose like a hiss, timed with the shadow's progression, as if they believed the serpent was exhaling across the heavens. The phrase he used, anhelitus serpentis, the serpent's breath, was repeated in later commentaries, carrying forward the memory of that blood-red night. A quirky echo of that image surfaced centuries later. On December 21, 2012, observers in the Guatemalan highlands reported that dawn came late. The horizon glowed, yet the sun seemed slow to rise, as if hesitating. Scientists explained it as an effect of atmospheric haze, ordinary and natural. Yet to those who stood waiting, it felt uncanny. Some villagers described it as the serpent pausing before exhaling again, the breath caught in its coils. In the rhythm of expectation, the delay felt monumental, a pause in the turning of time itself. Debate arises whenever such anomalies are recounted. Skeptics insist that atmospheric phenomena, eclipses and solar delays are common, recorded throughout history without need for myth. they caution against linking them to 2012, arguing that cycles invite interpretation where none is required. Yet believers counter that the timing is too precise, the symbols too resonant to ignore. A blood-red moon in 1631, a delayed dawn in 2012, both framed in serpent imagery, both marking the rhythm of cycles. Even if coincidence, they feed the sense of continuity that defines the Maya vision of time. Imagine standing on a mountain ridge in Guatemala on that solstice morning. The air is sharp and cold, your breath visible in the dim light. Around you, villagers murmur softly, their faces turned east. The horizon glows with pale fire, but the sun lingers unseen as if reluctant. Minutes stretch into an eternity. The silence deepens until it feels like a presence, heavy and expectant. Then at last the sun breaks free, its disk rising suddenly, flooding the world with warmth. You feel the release, the exhale, the serpent's breath returning. Relief mixes with awe. You have witnessed not the end of time, but its pause, a reminder that cycles move with their own rhythm, not ours. A quirky letter circulating anonymously in the years after 2012 claimed to compare these anomalies with codices long hidden. The writer described a glyph of a serpent exhaling fire paired with the phrase "the ninth flame." He argued that the 2012 solstice marked the awakening of this ninth flame, not as destruction, but as renewal. The letter was unsigned, its provenance uncertain. Some dismissed it as forgery, others treated it as revelation. The very ambiguity added to its allure another fragment coiling into the spiral of debate. Historians point out that such anomalies often gain power in retrospect. People look back and find meaning in ordinary events, weaving them into cycles. Yet this is precisely how Maya cosmology functioned. It was not about predicting catastrophe, but about recognizing resonance. An eclipse was never merely shadow, it was the serpent's breath. A delayed dawn was not merely atmospheric haze, it was the serpent's pause. To live in cycles was to live in meaning, to see each anomaly as part of a larger rhythm. Debate also surrounds whether these anomalies were noticed only locally or whether they were monitored by institutions such as the Vatican. Some suggest that reports of the delayed dawn in 2012 reached Rome quietly, added to files already thick with references to spirals and serpents. Others doubt such claims, noting that no official records mention them. Yet the idea that even modern anomalies were catalogued in silence fits the pattern established centuries earlier. Letters restricted, manuscripts locked behind 3 keys, telescopes shut. The serpent does not roar, it whispers, and its whispers are often hidden. Imagine yourself leafing through an archive in Rome, the air dry and silent. You come across a folder labeled only with a date, 2012. Inside are clippings, reports, and a single photograph of a red dawn over Guatemala. No commentary accompanies it, no explanation, only the image, stark and silent, as if inviting interpretation. You stare at it until the colors blur, until the serpent seems to shimmer in the light. You realize the record is not about data, but about memory. The photograph is evidence of resonance, nothing more, nothing less. Quirky folk tales in Central America keep these anomalies alive in another way. Children are told that on the solstice of 2012, the serpent turned in its sleep, rolling over to face a new direction. The delayed dawn was the moment of its stirring. Elders say that blood-red moons are its sighs, reminders that cycles continue. Such tales may not appear in scholarly records, but they persist in memory, woven into nightly stories, retold under starlight. They keep alive the sense that time is alive, that the serpent is still breathing. From eclipses to delayed dawns, from anonymous letters to whispered folktales, the anomalies of past and present thread themselves into the same coil. Whether natural or supernatural, they are perceived as signs, markers of the serpent's turning. And from these signs, the path leads back into the jungle, where, in the years after 2012, men in black robes, the Jesuits, were said to have returned, gathering fragments, photographing glyphs, searching for the next loop of the spiral. The serpent had not ended, it was moving again, and they were following. The years after 2012 carried no apocalypse, no collapse of the heavens, but something quieter, movements in the jungle, whispers in archives, the quiet footsteps of men in black robes. Reports began to surface of Jesuit scholars traveling once again into Central America, not as missionaries this time, but as collectors, archivists, seekers of fragments. Locals spoke of strangers arriving with cameras and notebooks, slipping into ruins at dawn, photographing carvings and inscriptions newly uncovered by vines and rain. They moved quietly, as if not wishing to draw attention, yet their presence was noticed. One report describes a group of these men visiting a site deep in the Guatemalan highlands. There, a partially collapsed stela had been unearthed after a landslide. Its surface bore 13 divisions, coiled around a central glyph that resembled a spiral. Beneath the spiral, faint but legible, was the date corresponding to December 21st, 2012. Yet just below it, a newer carving had appeared. Whether original or added later was unclear. The glyph suggested movement not toward an end, but toward continuation. The phrase, "it turns." Photographs were taken, sketches copied, and the stela was left where it lay. Within weeks, rumors spread that the images had been carried to Rome, placed once more into restricted drawers.
This is unbelievable.
A quirky detail lingers in one eyewitness account. A villager claimed that as the men photographed the stela, a shaft of sunlight broke through clouds, striking the spiral glyph directly. He described it as if the stone had lit up, glowing briefly before fading back into shadow. The Jesuits, he said, exchanged glances but said nothing, continuing their work in silence. Whether coincidence or omen, the image of light awakening the spiral haunted those who heard the story. It felt like confirmation that the cycle had not ended in 2012, but had only begun to turn anew. Debate about these post-2012 expeditions remains heated. Skeptics argue that the stories of Jesuits in the jungle are little more than folklore, shaped by centuries of suspicion toward Rome. No official records confirm such journeys, and the photographs said to exist have never been released publicly. Yet others point to consistent reports from multiple villages, each describing men in dark clothing, careful and deliberate, documenting glyphs. The consistency, they argue, suggests substance beneath the rumors. The debate mirrors the cycle itself, turning endlessly, never resolved, always returning. Imagine standing at the edge of a clearing as dawn rises. Mist curls above the trees, the air smells of earth and wet leaves. You watch as men unfold tripods and carefully aim their cameras at a weathered stone. They work methodically, their voices low, their movements practiced. The stone bears spirals, serpents, and dates, its surface chipped but still alive with meaning. As the sun climbs higher, light spills across the carvings, illuminating each line as though revealing secrets one by one. You feel as if you are intruding on a ritual, not of prayer, but of preservation. Quirky anecdotes circulate about the materials gathered during these expeditions. Some villagers insist that small artifacts were removed, ceramic shards, fragments of painted plaster, even tiny Codex scraps preserved in caves. Others claim nothing was taken, that only photographs and sketches were made. Still others suggest that offerings were left in exchange, small coins or candles placed at the base of the stones. The variety of accounts makes it impossible to know the truth. Yet the image of men in robes trading fragments of modern devotion for ancient memory lingers in imagination. Debate extends to the meaning of the new glyphs reportedly found. Were they authentic, carved centuries ago and only now uncovered? Or were they modern additions etched by local hands seeking to continue tradition or attract attention? Scholars argue both sides, but the symbolism remains potent. The glyph beneath the 2012 date reading "It turns" fits perfectly with the Maya vision of cyclical time. Whether ancient or modern, authentic or invented, the message is the same. The cycle did not end. It continues, turning silently, inexorably, like the serpent devouring its tail. Imagine handling the photograph said to exist in restricted files. You hold a glossy print, its edges curled, its surface reflecting light. The image shows a stela covered in vines, the spiral glyph at its center, the faint phrase "it turns" beneath it. Your eyes linger on the spiral, tracing its loops, feeling again the pull of cycles. You wonder whether the glyph is genuine, whether the carving is old or new, but the question fades beneath the image's power. Authentic or not, the spiral speaks. It insists that time is alive, still coiling, still breathing. Quirky folk stories in Central America have woven these modern expeditions into myth. Children are told that after 2012, the serpent opened its eye again, and men in black came to witness it. Some say the serpent allowed them to take its photograph, but only if they promised not to share it. Others claim that the serpent remains hidden in the stones, waiting for the next cycle, revealing itself only in light. These stories may be fanciful, but they echo the same motif: silence, secrecy, continuation. The serpent does not end, it turns. Debate among modern historians mirrors the unease of earlier centuries. Were the Jesuits seeking knowledge or suppressing it? Were they preserving fragments for future study, or hiding them to prevent disruptive interpretations? No one can say with certainty. The absence of public evidence leaves only rumor, and rumor coils like the serpent, tightening with each retelling. What is clear is that the cycle's imagery remains alive, not only in glyphs and codices, but in the minds of those who tell these stories. Imagine walking away from the clearing after the men have departed. The jungle reclaims its silence, birds begin to call, and mist rises once more. The stela remains, its spiral faintly visible, its glyphs waiting patiently for the next light to awaken them. You carry with you the memory of the scene, the men in black, the flash of light, the silent serpent turning. You realize that you are part of the cycle now, a witness drawn into its coil, carrying its rhythm forward. From these modern whispers of expeditions, the story turns toward its close, for the serpent's message has always been the same: time does not end, it renews. The final section slows its pace, lengthens its breath, drawing the cycle to a resting place. The serpent coils once more, not in fear, but in peace. It's turning now a lullaby.